Hello everyone, my name is Razi. I'm an Airbus A320 rated pilot based in Switzerland, and today we are going to talk about the Pakistan international flight that went down in Karachi. So on May 22nd, 2020, a PIA flight PK8303 Airbus 320-200 with CFM56 engines took off from Lahore shortly after 1 p.m. and was scheduled to land at Jinnah International Airport in Karachi at around 2:30 p.m. The weather was good, mild wind was around the airport, outside temperature was 35 degrees centigrade, and the visibility was 7 kilometers or more. The flight was carrying 91 passengers and 8 crew members. So the airplane made a go-around in Karachi, and in her second approach, the lost engines and stalled and eventually crashed a few hundred meters short of the runway 25 left, over a densely populated residential area known as Model Colony, killing everybody on board except 2. Although many buildings and grounds were damaged, so far no death has been reported other than the people on board. Now, this accident is the third catastrophic aviation disaster in the history of Pakistan. Now, I'll divide my video into 4 parts. First of all, we will talk about the sequence of events, and then we'll try to analyze what went wrong and how did it go wrong. There will be a summary and followed by a conclusion. Now, this is what we know from Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority, Aviation Safety Database, Aviation Herald, and international media. The plane had enough fuel to fly for 2 hours and 34 minutes, while the total flight time was recorded 1 hour and 33 minutes. At 2:30 p.m., the plane was 15 nautical miles from Karachi at Makli, flying at an altitude of 10,000 feet instead of 7,000 feet. Now, when the air traffic controllers issued its first warning to the pilots to lower the plane's altitude, instead of lowering the aircraft's altitude, the pilots responded saying that we're comfortable and we have this under control. At 10 nautical miles to touchdown, the aircraft was at an altitude of 7,000 feet instead of 3,000 feet. Now, the air traffic controls issued a second warning to the pilot to lower the aircraft's attitude. Now, the pilots responded again, saying that they were satisfied and they will handle the situation and they are ready for the landing. At about 5 nautical miles from touchdown, the aircraft was at 3,500 feet or maybe slightly more instead of being at 1,680 feet. Now, this is what we could calculate from the approach plate of the airport. The air traffic controller, understanding the gravity of the situation, they advised the pilot to turn right heading 180. This means the ATC offered kind of a help to the pilots to discontinue the approach, which was probably dangerous and not stabilized, and they're trying to give them a second chance to go somewhere, stabilize themselves, and come back again for a fresh approach. The pilots, they override the air traffic controller, saying that they established an ILS 25 left.
We are comfortable now, and we are out of 3,500 for 3,000. Established ILS 25 left. Sir, we are established on ILS 25 left.
So you are 5 miles from touchdown, distance passing 3,500.
To our calculation, to be established in ILS 25 left at 5 nautical mile, the aircraft should be somewhere at around 1,680 feet, whereas they were at 3,500 feet or more. Just to understand the situation a little bit, the relationship between the pilots and the ATC over aviation industries and culture, it could be different from one place to the other. And in this case, the ATC, without any further argument, they clears the pilot to land. As the pilot acknowledged the landing clearance, we can hear a continuous repetitive chime on the background. It's called CRC. It's something like ding, 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 ding. Now, this is a master warning. You can get this kind of warning in an aircraft if you have an engine fire or a landing gear flaps over speed, etc., etc. Now, calculation says that the aircraft was probably between 2,000 and 3,000 feet when you have heard this continuous chime, ding, 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 ding sound. Now, there was no indication from the pilot to the air traffic controller that something was wrong with the aircraft. The pilots landed almost halfway down the runway at 4,500 feet without the landing gears. The engines made the first contact with the runway, and after multiple contacts with the runway, scraping and damaging both engines, eventually they could lift off at somewhere passing 7,000 to 8,000 feet off the runway. Now, I'm guessing when they made the first contact with the engine, realizing the fact that the gears were not down, they tried to rev up their engine. They wanted to go around with full power, and eventually scrapping and damaging the engines to a higher degree. Experts believe that when the engines scraped the ground, the engine's oil tank, the fuel pump, and the accessory gearbox, or the AGB, might have been damaged. And in CFM56 engines, if you see, the AGB or the gearbox is located right under the engine, which is covered by a very thin cowling. After the failed attempt of landing, the aircraft continued to climb to 3,000 feet as cleared by the ATC on radar heading 110. Now, as per the Flight Radar 24 data, the airplane briefly climbed to 3,000 feet and then started losing altitude and detected by approach radar for maintaining growth 2,000 feet or lower. Now, the pilots replied they were trying to maintain 2,000 feet. And at this moment, we can hear a horn in the cockpit, which probably refers to not attempting to capture the altitude which was set in the FCU or flight control unit. Now, before we go around, normally the pilots, they set a desired altitude on the FCU to capture that. And in this case, they were not being able to capture that, so the aircraft was giving them a warning. Now, in the second approach, we can see from the video that the landing gears were extended when the airplane was rapidly descending before the impact with the ground. So there was probably no malfunction with the gears, and neither the gears did hit the runway at unlocked position. No damage was observed on the landing gear doors, and the pilots also never reported any landing gear issue to the air traffic controller as per the audio tape. Pilots made a cut corner towards the runway. A plane spotter picture shows the RAT or the ram air turbine was deployed, and the engine nacelles were damaged. Now, on query from the air traffic controller, the pilot advised they have lost engine, or engine is not very clear from the tape, and they declare Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Now, the aircraft was seen going down with a high angle of attack and a high rate of descent, and probably stalled short of the runway over the build-up area. The landing gears were down when it hit the ground, and there were ground observers, those who have confirmed that the aircraft went silent or the engines were completely silent before moments of the crash. Now, let's analyze the situation, what happened. From my opinion, observing the pattern of the flying, the pilot was manually hand-flying the aircraft all the way down. And it's not really possible to understand if he had his speed brakes deployed or not. This data is crucial to know what triggered the CRC, or the continuous chime, at around 2,000 feet plus minus. Was it the landing gear, or was it the flaps over speed? Now, we need to understand the limitations of Airbus A320. The maximum landing gear extension speed is 250 knots, and flap extension speed is 230 knots. And above these speeds, you cannot deploy the landing gears or the flaps, and you'll get a warning. Now, besides speed brakes, pilots often early extend the landing gear to reduce the speed in the approach. Now, landing gear creates a lot of drag that might work more efficiently to reduce the speed rather than the speed brakes on a hot day like this, on a high and fast approach like this. If we analyze the speed versus altitude graph from the Flight Radar 24, it seems like they were carrying more than 250 knots at approximately 7,000 feet and also at 2,000 feet. So what does that mean? If the pilot would have tried to extend the landing gear or the flaps, the Airbus protection envelope would prevent that, to secure the aircraft from overstress and structural damage. Now, she will generate a CRC, or it's like a master warning to caution the pilots that, hey, this is unacceptable. You are crossing the limits. Let's take a quick look how the landing gear safety works. There are two ADR, or air data reference, in Airbus. This is ADR 1 and ADR 3, determine the indicated airspeed. If the speed is higher than 260 knots, and either ADR detects that, a safety valve closes and prevents the gear from being extended until the speed drops below 260 knots. Now, the landing gear max extension speed is 250 knots. If the ADR 1 and ADR 3 both fail, then the high speed signal would not be able to be sent to the safety valve. Now the Airbus, they have foreseen this, and they have designed the system to close the safety valve if ADR1 and 3 both fail. The gear must be extended by gravity, and retraction is not available at this time. The gravity gear extension system overrides everything, and the gear could be extended at any speed by using the gravity gear extension handle. In a standard ILS approach, the rate of descent should not exceed 1,000 feet per minute. Now, in this case, we can calculate that at 2,000 feet, they made a desperate dive on the ILS, exceeding 7,000 feet per minute rate of descent, which is completely unacceptable, and this is dangerous. The airspeed exceeded 250 knots, whereas it should have been something around like 170 or 180 knots. And the last few minutes to touchdown, the rate of descent was around 2,000 feet per minute, instead of 650 to 750 feet per minute, depending on the weather and the wind. And the aircraft did not go any slower than 210 knots throughout its entire approach. Now let's take a look at human factors. I'm speaking to you sitting in my living room. It's very calm and it's very comfortable here. But when you're up there and when you're analyzing so much of data, you're having bombardments of warning from the air traffic controllers, from the aircraft systems. You're too high and too hot. Your stress level will be shooting out of the roof, and this is going to impair your judgment. When your stress level is that high, the first sense you're going to lose is your auditory sense. If you try to put all the available evidences and logics together, most probably the chime that you have heard at around 2,000 feet refers to the flaps over speed. That is 230 knots plus. Now, if the speed was 250 knots, they could have been able to lower the landing gear and reduce the speed below 230 knots to extend the flaps, which they did not. Now, the question remains, did they forget to lower the landing gear? Well, the Airbus has 4 alerts to remind you of the landing gear. There's a visual indication on the landing gear panel, a red light illuminates, an oral master warning alert, which is impossible to miss, a red warning on the ECAM, and too low gear. This kind of oral alert on the GBWS. It might have happened that they have forgotten to lower the landing gear, and then they inhibited the GBWS warning system by pressing the SYS push button on the overhead panel to silence the cockpit. Now, most likely, they forgot to lower the landing gears and then ignored the warnings and silenced it, or the aircraft's self-protection system stopped the gears from being deployed. Now, this is possible in a high-task saturation situation, especially when you're flying manually. You're gushing down the approach and chasing an impossible thing, like intercepting the glide slope from above, and at the same time, you're trying to reduce your speed. Now, maybe the pilot thought of lowering the landing gears after deploying the flaps too, which they could never deploy as the speed was always above 230 knots all the way till 1,200 feet. Now they touched down at 4,500 feet in the runway with a speed of something between 210 and 220 knots. Now, if the speed was under control and they were in the correct vertical profile, they should have touched at 1,500 feet. From the picture of the spotter, it seems like the flaps were clean on the pattern and the gears were up. If the flight had any landing gear issues, they would most likely keep the gears down and would not retract the gears. After go around, it's less likely that the pilots would clean up in the pattern, so flaps never got deployed is also a possibility. Now, if the landing gear was down the first approach and not locked, the landing gear could have been damaged beyond retraction, or separated from the undercarriage on the runway, or the landing gear door would have been damaged. Now, neither of these evidences were seen from the picture taken by the plane spotter. An Airbus 320 can carry between 150 or 180 passengers. Now, with 1 hour of fuel, 91 passengers, 8 crew members, it's not a very heavy aircraft. It's rather a moderately light aircraft. So another possibility or another possible cause of the airplane floating 4,500 feet down the runway before it touched down could be due to the clean flap configuration, the extra speed it was carrying, and the airplane being moderately light. And that is also an explanation why they could lift off without a tail strike as they came down with a slight nose-on attitude 220 knot speed, and clean flaps. Now the picture indicates damage to the engine at an angle consistent with the flare. Now in this weather condition and airport elevation and considering the aircraft's weight, I would guess that the ideal approach speed could have been something between 134 or 137 knots, or probably between 140 knots. So from the weather data, it seems like there was no strong tailwind which could contribute to such a high ground speed. And in my guess, they were approximately 85 to 90 knots faster than the expected or target approach speed. Now, let's take a look at a couple of small questions. Does speed brake have any effect on the audible warnings? In my opinion, no. Could the pilots have captured the glide slope? In my opinion, no. Was there any chance that the GPWS warning did not function? Well, in my opinion, no. Even if the radio altimeter is damaged, there are other redundancies to generate warnings. We saw the RAT or the ram air turbine deployed in the picture. In Airbus A320, the ram air turbine will automatically deploy in case of loss of both AC bus 1 and 2 or loss of hydraulics. And after dual engine failure, the QRH does not mention anything about the ram air turbine. From the picture of the spotter, it seems that the pilots switched on the APU, or at least they have switched on the APU master switch on, and we can see that the APU flap or the APU air intake flap was open at the tail section. Now if you zoom on the picture, it looks like a small black spot. Now this brings another question. If the pilot switched on the APU and the APU was on, why the emergency generator or the RAT was deployed? And now we don't know if the APU was operational or not. And the moment you press the APU master switch on, it takes some time for the APU to be switched on. It's something like 90 seconds or more. When did the pilots lower the gears on the second approach? From the spotter's picture, it seems like the gears were lowered after the ram air turbine or the RAT was deployed, and probably after the dual engine failure. Now the question is, had they delayed the landing gear extension, could they have reached the runway? Perhaps, maybe, or maybe not. Now, it's also not very clear if they were able to extend the flaps and slats, the most important lift augmentation device. The high angle of attack of the airplane seen in the footage moments before the crash, and the limited hydraulic capabilities of RAT and the initial high-speed regime in the downwind, as indicated by the flight radar data, supports the idea of flaps and slats not being deployed at all. And one more thing, there were few speculations as reported in media that the airplane had reported nose gear landing issues to the air traffic controller or experienced a bird strike during a go-around. Now, none of these claims were supported by any substantial evidences or any kind of authentic sources. Now, we will be coming up to our summaries. So let's see, this is an ongoing investigation, and the investigators will find out the root cause of the accident, and the truth is going to come out very soon. But however, this is evident that a continuation of an unstable approach is probably the single most contributing factor in this tragic accident. Now, if airlines could implement and enforce approach stabilization criteria meticulously, human losses and fatalities like this could have been prevented. Now, this can be the key lesson of this PIA crash. To prevent this kind of situation, the regulatory authorities and aircraft manufacturers have introduced standard operating procedures, or SOP. And a very important one is the stabilization criteria on the approach to land. The aircraft must be in correct lateral and vertical profile and must be fully configured and in correct speed for landing at 1,000 feet IMC or 500 feet VMC. And if not, the pilot must go around. CRM, or Crew Resource Management, is enforced in aviation by the authorities. Now, what is CRM? CRM means both the pilots in the cockpit, they work together as a team, they have a job sharing, and they keep a lookout on each other. Now, this is not a one-man show. If one of the pilots is not meeting the parameter, is not following the rules, this is the job of the other pilot to intervene immediately for safety security issues. Now, the first officer in this case needs to be assertive enough to stand up to the captain and say that stop, you're doing things which is not on the standard operating procedure, or you're going beyond rules, and the first officer has a lawful authority to take over the control from the captain if he deems unsafe. Now, having said that, in some airlines, due to cultural reason, the cockpit has a very steep gradient where the captain is sole authority. Now, it makes the first officer's task very challenging to defend or to go against the captain when this is required, when the situation is unsafe and where he needs to take control. Training standardization and quality monitoring is recommended. Now, this might include practice of rejected landing, approach stabilization, and mandatory go-around scenarios or pilot intervention models during the recurrent simulator training and type ratings. So there's something called pilot incapacitation, which all pilots are taught during their type ratings. So what is this? Pilot incapacitation in normal sense means if one of your colleague or if one of the pilot is physically incapacitated for any reason, he faints or he has a heart attack, that is pilot incapacitation, and the first officer or the other crew, the captain, whoever is not incapacitated, is taking the control of the flight. Now, on a broader sense, one of the pilot could be wide awake and he might also be incapacitated at the same time due to shock, due to depression, due to substance abuse, or it could be any such thing. So what are the signs that a pilot would understand that my colleague is incapacitated? He might be giving out non-standard callouts. He might be making mistakes that normally he shouldn't make, or he is displaying attitude which is unlikely of him. So these are the moments the colleague pilot should be aware or careful that this might be a case of pilot incapacitation and he might need to take over the flight for the safety reason. Protective role and straightforward communication of air traffic controller enhances safety. For example, in this case, the air traffic controller could continue vectoring the flight till it was close to a standard vertical profile for the approach, without giving the pilots a choice to continue a rather unstable approach. Dear viewers, we are at the end of the video, so please let us know what do you think about this crash, and please feel free to participate. Your participation is going to enrich our discussion. But let's keep in mind that this is an ongoing investigation. We should refrain from speculation and we should restrict our discussion based on the substantial evidences that we have collected from reliable sources. Rest in peace, and may God bless the departed souls and the victims of PK Flight 8303. Thank you very much for being with us. Goodbye.